I'm Alex and welcome back to Spellbound Weaving and Dyeing. Today I'll be dyeing these two different fibres, Tencel and Egyptian cotton, and I can't wait for you to see how they turn out. Okay, so I'm going to start first by mixing up my dye, and then I will put my yarn out and I'll show you how I'm going to achieve this effect today. So the first colour that I'm mixing up, I'm only using two colours today. I've got some of my Dharma Fibre Reactive Procion dyes. The first that I'm going to be mixing up is our bright yellow. So this is just like the most beautiful, beautiful yellow, and I think it's really important to have your primary colours in your toolkit, so your reds, your blue, and your yellow, and Dharma will actually show you they do have their three primary colours. It's perfect for mixing if you want to experiment with your different colours. Now, from the last episode we talked a little bit about how much of our dye that we want to mix up. Okay, so remembering from Dharma's measurements, we're going to be using 2 teaspoons of dye per 8 ounces. Or 240 mils. So this bottle here is, when it's filled to the very, very brim, is 250 mils. So that gives you, it kind of makes it a bit easier to figure out. So 2 teaspoons for a bottle this size. Don't forget though that if our colour has a star on it, so this is a good example, the blue that we're using has a star next to the name, you double the amount of dye to get it true to colour. So we're going to be using 2 teaspoons of dye if we're making a full bottle. Now I don't want a full bottle of dye today, I'm only going to mix up half the amount, which means I'm only going to use 1 teaspoon of dye for our bright yellow. Now the other colour that I'm mixing today is the Caribbean blue. We did use this same dye powder when we did our first speckled dye job. I just love the way that that colour breaks, and I remember seeing how those two colours interacted really made me decide to choose these. So our Caribbean blue has the star next to it, which means we double the amount of dye. So if I'm only making a half amount of this, instead of using 1 teaspoon of dye for half a bottle, I'm going to be using 2 teaspoons of our blue dye to half of our bottle, so to 120 mils of water. So I'm going to mix up these dyes. So I'm using a half teaspoon measuring spoon today. Now I like to give my spoon and my funnel a rinse before I then measure up the next colour. You can see that there is some dye powder left in there, and you might end up with something that you are not expecting if you don't give those a rinse in between mixing your colours. Okay, so you can see that I've only added half the amount of water to these bottles, so we're only using a 120 mils. The next thing that I'm going to do is put my lids on and shake those up. Now, I also like to label my bottles. That just helps me to keep track of what colour I've used, how much colour I've used. That way, if I need to mix more, there's no guesswork. I don't have to try and remember off the top of my head how much of each colour needed to go in which bottle. This also is really useful and a good habit to get into, especially if you do progress to mixing colours. There's nothing worse than trying to remember the formula that you used for a colour off the top of your head. So 1 teaspoon, 120 mils, and then this was our bright yellow. It's such a gorgeous yellow, I'm so excited. And then this one was our Caribbean blue, and we used 2 teaspoons, so double the amount to 120 mils, and this was our Caribbean blue. Beautiful. Keep mixing those till all of that dye powder is completely mixed. Now, on a spare page of our record keeping journal, I'm going to put a little record of what those colours look like mixed up. Bright, bright, beautiful yellow. Perfect, I'm happy with that. Beautiful. Absolutely gorgeous. That blue is one of my favorites, I think. Now the reason that I've chosen these two colours today, they are quite, you know, your basic sort of primary colours, is because I wanted to do a dye job, something very, very simple, where we can show what those colours do when they do strike together. So blue and yellow, obviously you get green, which is what I'm trying to achieve today, with have a little bit of tonal variety as well within those two colours. So let's just get started and see what happens. Now I have got today two different fibres that I'm going to be dyeing alongside each other. The first of those fibres is Tencel, which I haven't dyed on this channel before, but it is one of my favourite cellulose fibres to dye. It is like a very heavy fibre when you actually pick it up, especially when it's wet. It is quite a heavy feeling fibre, but very, very shiny. I think it's like it's a cellulose fibre that comes from the pulp. It's like a pulp made from pulp of, I think, eucalyptus. So I like to sort of liken it, and I say to people, if you're not comfortable using silk, if you are, I say it's like a vegan silk almost. So obviously it doesn't have exactly the same properties, but if you're looking for something that is quite smooth, quite silky, then Tencel might be the fibre for you. So check it out. I've got two 100-gram skeins of Tencel that I'm going to be laying alongside each other. Now I'm not too worried about where these skeins, you know, sort of start, or lining up the start and the finish of these. I'm only planning on using one of these skeins in my projects, and I will actually be starting to list some of the yarns that I dye for sale through my Etsy store. I'll link to that once it's all completely up and running in terms of selling the yarn. Now the next fibre that I have today is Egyptian cotton. So it's another cotton blend. It's not a blend, it's another cotton yarn, but it is quite like a luxurious cotton, I guess you could say. So it's a little less fluffy. It's not shiny like mercerized cotton, but it does have, it's just a little bit more luxurious than, say, like the ring spun cotton, which is a little bit fluffier and a little bit more so like, for example, ring spun cotton, great for like tea towels, something if you want something a little bit less, I don't want to say refined, that's probably not the right word, but the Egyptian cotton is really quite soft. It sort of breaks in quite softly. So if you are wanting something a little bit fancier, a little bit fancier, then you could definitely go with some Egyptian cotton. So these are all plant-based. These are both plant-based fibres. You can see the huge difference in the natural colours. I think that the Tencel comes as a bleached colour. I don't think you can buy like a natural coloured Tencel. I think it only comes in that very, very white shade, which makes it perfect for dyeing though, because it just sucks up that dye and you get the most bright, vibrant colours. So for dyeing these skeins of yarn today, what I wanted to do is I wanted to use my like little pipettes, my little droppers. These are from Dharma, but you'd be able to find them easily online from elsewhere. I like to wash and reuse them. And I'm going to be using my metal bowls and my two dye colours. So I'm not too fussed about where the placement of my colour goes. I want to keep it quite random. I just wanted to do something really fun, really easy, and just see what we end up with. Okay, so I think that I will start with my bright yellow today. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to pour this into my bowl. Just makes it a bit easier for me to pick it up. And all I'm going to do, I don't want to think about this too much, you know. I just wanted to do something fun and something easy. So just literally sucking up that dye, and I'm just going to start to drop it on the yarn. Like I said, I'm not worried. The fun thing about dyeing in this way is that usually when I'm when I'm weaving like a large, long piece of fabric, I weave a lot of baby wraps for baby wearing. And what that means is if you're dyeing a weft, you're going to need to dye more than one skein of fibre at a time. And usually you want a really sort of uniform dye job, which means that you have to try and make each skein pretty much exactly the same, which can be tricky, you know. Yes, it's a science, but it's also an art, and sometimes it's a bit random and it's a bit crazy. But the fun thing about this is I'm just having fun. I'm seeing what I end up with, and I think it's fun to experiment, and it it might not end up exactly the way that you expect it to, but you might end up with something really beautiful, which is great. So I have left a lot of soda ash water in this yarn. I haven't squeezed it out too much because I wanted that color to really wick through that yarn. You can see it happening. Hopefully you can see it happening as I'm dropping this blue, and I'm not just dropping it straight on top of that yellow. What I'm doing is I'm just dropping it next to it, hoping that it will travel through the yarn, and we're getting some mixing here of our blue and of our yellow. Now this yellow does look quite dark, it does look quite orange on the yarn, but as I mentioned in one of my previous videos, if it looks a bit scary when you're dyeing, it will probably end up perfect when you go to rinse your yarn. So there's nothing worse, and this is a lesson that I learned when I first started dyeing, was when you dye your yarn, if it looks perfect and you go, oh my god, that's the perfect color, I'm so happy. Once you rinse it out and that yarn dries, it'll probably end up a fair bit lighter, and that can sometimes be really disappointing. This is so much fun, just having a play, and you can see where that blue and that yellow are mixing and creating the most gorgeous green. Now these skeins are very big. They're both 100-gram skeins of yarn, which means that they work really well for dyeing in this sort of way, for dyeing when you're doing things a bit randomly, a bit speckled. You're not worrying too much about that dye completely penetrating through to the other side. If you were wanting full coverage and a very precise dye job, I would suggest to measure up smaller skeins of yarn so that you can have a bit more control in terms of color placement. But like I said, when you're just wanting to have a bit of fun, there's absolutely nothing wrong with just going for it. This is so much fun. So you can see now that I'm adding my yellow onto the top of my blue. And just, oh, so beautiful. It's almost like a tealy green at the moment, it's looking like. See that Tencel, the whiter fibre is just like, shoo, it's just like sucking up that dye. It's just incredible. I'm going to have a little look underneath to see what's happening on the other side of this yarn. So you can see we don't have much coverage on the other side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some more onto the top. I am not going to flip this yarn today, but that tells me that yes, while it looks perfect placement wise on this side, I might want to go a little bit heavier on this side, because we will be balancing out the most of that white from the other side. So what I want to do is I'm getting most of that dye out, and I'm going to do some little spots. So what I've done is I've emptied most of the dye out of my little dropper, and that's giving me a little bit more control in terms of those little tiny splashes of yarn. So this would be a good way to do some speckling as well if you want a bit more control over those colours not breaking. So I'm sucking up just a little bit, taking most of it out, and then just splashing it. Make sure you cover your workspaces and your clothes when you do this. It is a little bit messy. Handy so that you can clean as you go. Makes it a bit of less of a huge job when you are done. Now I'm going to do the same with my yellow. of a jawbreaker with all of that dye speckled all over. Now, I've changed my mind. Oh, look at that. Beautiful. Oh my goodness, I'm so excited right now. Look at those colors just mixing and combining. So what I want to do, I think, let me think. No, I won't flip it, but I will add some more of those darker sections and try and really mix those colors, because at the moment we've just got a little bit of bleeding where the colors are joining, but I really want to mix them a bit more and have a bit more of a controlled mix of those colors. So, oh wow, beautiful. Ah, just absolutely gorgeous. Look at that. Look at that. Beautiful. I'm so excited. And you can really see how those colors are sort of like on the Tencel, because that yarn was like bleached to begin with. It was a lot lighter to begin with. That's how it comes from the mill. You do have a lot, like it's a lot lighter, and the colors are a lot brighter and more saturated because they have a lighter base to begin with. My goodness, I'm so excited about this. So the plan for processing this is I will be just wrapping it up, and I'll likely rinse it tonight, probably after around 6 or 7 hours, and we'll see how it looks. One little trick that you can do is you can put your yarn in the oven for about an hour on a very, very low temperature, so around, I think I usually do, oh there's a fly, gross. I usually do about 50 degrees Celsius, so not Fahrenheit, about 50 degrees Celsius in the oven for an hour, and that just really tops off that processing time. If you are in a rush, it's a really good way to speed things up as well. Just make sure it's completely wrapped up, completely covered before you put it in, and on like a baking tray that you're not going to use again. I might do one more little round with the big droppers, like some more of the big sections, because I'm just reminding myself that there's not really, I don't know if you can see that, there's really not that much colour through on the other side, so you can see. So that's why I'm allowing myself to really do a bit more on this side, because the more you start to move that yarn as well, the more you do lose those little speckles. And we had so much fun doing them. We don't want them to blend and blur too much, and they will continue to sort of spread a little bit, as I left this yarn so moist and so wet when it came out of the soda ash. Usually I would squeeze a lot more of that soda ash water out of the yarn. To wrap this up and leave it to process on my bench space. I'm not going to move it. Like I said, I don't want those speckles to merge too much, so I've got a little bit of space where the plastic hasn't reached. I'm just going to add some more plastic over the top to keep that nice and moist to process, and I will show it to you when it's ready to rinse. A quick note, when we do rinse this yarn, because we have a lot of white space that we haven't dyed, I absolutely recommend using some Synthropol Textile detergent or Blue Dawn dish soap. That will just really stop your dye from back staining and sort of, yeah, staining these white parts of the yarn. Okay, so I'm going to start rinsing my skeins of yarn now. I'm going to individually rinse the dye out of each one and then soak them all together. So I've got my yarn here. I think I'm going to start with one of the Tencel skeins. Wow. Oh my goodness, this is so beautiful. Look at that. Look at that colour. It's so pretty. Alrighty, so I'm going to use like warm water to start with. Just holding the yarn over my hand and just letting all of that dye and soda ash water, rinse out of my yarn. You can see that that colour is really bright and vibrant. Now I finished dyeing this yarn at around 1:30 and it's now almost 7:30. So you can see how bright that yarn is, and in the past I would have probably batched this for 24 hours, but watching my last video about dyeing times and processing times, go back and watch that. I'll link it below, or I might link it on, I'll link that video and you can go and have a watch and see what happened when we tried dyeing the same yarn using different processing times. So that Tencel is just so bright and vibrant. I'm loving where that blue and that yellow have merged together. It just is beautiful. Bowl, fill it up with some hot water and some Fibre. And as I rinse each skein, I can then put it into my bowl to soak. And remember that Fibre detergent, or our Blue Dawn or Fairy dish soap, is going to make sure that the white parts of our yarn stay white as we rinse this dye out. So even if your water might look blue, your yarn is going to stay white in those sections, and that's what that detergent helps you to do. So I've got my bowl of soapy water and my yarn off to the side. Now I'm moving on to the first of the Egyptian cotton. So you can see that the yarn isn't quite as light. If I'm looking at the back of the skein, there's a lot of white there. So even if it may look like there's a lot of colour on one side, don't forget that dye is not going to go all the way through those thick skeins of yarn. And those colours are already starting to look a little bit different on the Egyptian cotton as they did on the Tencel, and that's because we've got the different fibre content. One is the Tencel, which is the shiny, very bleached white, which means you're automatically going to have brighter colours because you're starting on a much whiter base. Into the sink, top it up with just a little bit more hot water. I'm going to let this soak for a little while. I don't think that this yarn will need too many hot soaks because there isn't too much dye in there, and I will show you how it looks now when it's dry. So here you can see the 4 skeins that we dyed today. I'm absolutely blown away with how they look. So here we have our Tencel skeins. You can see that the colour is quite bright. It is quite vibrant. It has lightened up a fair bit from when we rinsed it and when the yarn was still wet. But those green sections are just absolutely gorgeous. So here I'm showing you the spots of green in between where the blue and the yellow. So we still have the yellow and the blue that we dyed, but just those gorgeous little green spots where those two colours did mix together. But there is a lot of sort of variety in that green as well. It's not sort of like, I guess, a solid colour, which is really interesting as well. Like, if I were to look at this, I wouldn't think that it was dyed only using 2 colours. Here are our Egyptian cotton skeins. You can see the colour is just a little bit softer on these skeins. You obviously don't have the shine from the Tencel, which does make the colours seem brighter, but we also did start on a base that was a little bit less white. So the Tencel obviously was bleached, so we have a little bit of a softer effect on our Egyptian cotton yarn. Thank you so much for watching today. Leave any comments below in the comment section and make sure you subscribe for future videos. Thank you so much.